Well, the last 2 weeks, we have been talking about faith. In the first week, we talked about faith takes first steps. Last week, we talked about that faith steps out of the boat. So today, we're going to talk about that faith follows even when the path is unknown. So sometimes God doesn't just call us to dip our toes in the waters or just to get out of our comfort zone. Sometimes He will call us on a journey, and He won't tell us where He's calling us. He's just going to say to go. It's a future that we can't see. But when He says go, and He doesn't exactly tell us where, or when He calls us to trust Him for the next chapter of our life, but we look at it and we say, but that chapter's not written yet. So today we're talking about walking by faith, not by sight. And then next week we'll finish the series by talking about maintaining your faith even in the fire, in the midst of the trials, in the midst of the difficult things that we face. But today we're exploring, this is very intentional in the wording, the sacred space between God's call and God's revelation. When we have to trust the guide even when we can't see the destination. Now, I know my kids love when they make it into sermons as illustrations. I figure Carly's getting ready to head off to college, so she gets one more before she doesn't have to hear it for a while, even if I use her as an example. But this coming Thursday, we're packing up a couple of cars, and we're driving down to Waco for Carly to begin her new adventure at Baylor. It's only 2 hours away, and in some ways that feels like, oh, it's just right down on the road. And in other ways, it feels like it might as well be, miles and miles and miles away. And it proves that it's possible to be excited and nervous and ready and terrified all at the same time. And that's us. I don't know how she's feeling, but that's how, us in the midst of that. And as her parents, we've tried to do the things we can to prepare her. We visited the campus, we went to orientation, we bought the dorm room essentials or continuing to buy the dorm room essentials, and we'll probably find some more when we're down there, and had conversations about college life. But there's only so much we can do to help prepare her for that. She and her roommates have met. They've spent time together. Hopefully they're going to hit it off well and everything, but you just pray for that to go as smoothly as possible, and I'm confident it will. We can't predict which professors will challenge her, which classes will stretch her thinking. We have no idea which friendships she's going to build that will shape her, which opportunities will present themselves, or what struggles that she'll face. But what we do know is this, she has grown up in faith. We've equipped her as much as possible with values and taught her to listen for God's voice, and we've seen her grow into an amazing young woman. And now we have to trust that the same God who has guided our family with her as part of it for these 18 years will continue to guide in the years to come. So in many ways, sending your child off to college is a step of faith. You're releasing them into a future you can't control. You're trusting that God's plan for their life is better than anything that you could orchestrate from the sidelines. But it's not just parenting kids into college, but also anyone following God's call into the known is a step of faith. And the reality is God doesn't give us a complete roadmap. We wish He would. We wish we could put it in our phone and see exactly the path it's going to take us and all the detours we might face along the way. But He gives us something better than that. He gives us His presence in the journey and His promise that He'll guide us step by step along the way. So whether you're 18 heading off to college, or whether you're in your 90s and sensing God calling you to something new, the pattern is the same. God's calling doesn't come with the GPS we wish it did, but it comes with a promise: I will be with you. And all of us crave certainty, don't we? We want detailed plans. We want, the outcomes to be guaranteed, but God's way often works differently. He calls us to follow Him into the known, not because He wants to keep us in suspense, but because He wants to build something in us that can only be developed through learning to trust Him. We live in a culture that has eliminated most uncertainty from our daily lives. We check the weather forecast. We track our packages in real time. I mean, really, some of the apps, depending on who it's at, you can tell where the driver is. And they're turning, especially if you're doing DoorDash or something, why did they stop there? Why didn't they come straight to my house? They have my food. It's getting cold. We get turn-by-turn directions to every destination. We read online reviews before we buy anything. We research restaurants before we make reservations. And we can basically know exactly how long our commute is going to be before we leave. Or maybe you're like me and that's the goal to beat, is the time that your app suggests. Technology like this can be a gift, but it can also be a problem for our faith life. And why is that? Because if God present, we get used to having all the information presented up front, and it becomes harder to trust God when he doesn't do that, and we get into that pattern. But if God revealed the entire pattern and plan to us up front, would we really even need faith? It could, if we could see exactly how everything was going to work out, would we really be trusting him, or would we just be executing a really detailed, well thought out plan? Think about any great adventure story. There's Frodo on his journey to Mount Doom in Mordor, or Lewis and Clark on their journey towards the Pacific. The uncertainty isn't a bug. The uncertainty is a feature. And the not knowing is what makes the journey an adventure rather than just a trip. And the same is true of our journey with God. Sometimes following God means choosing adventure over certainty and trusting the guide more than following a map. And that brings us to a story about someone that is known for his faith. And that person is Abraham. So we're going to look at the call of Abraham in Genesis 12 if you want to head that way, as he teaches us what it looks like to follow God when the path is unknown. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." And stopping real fast, I'm talking about Abraham. You see him referred to as Abram. That's his name before God changes it to Abraham. But God again says, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him. And Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. So look at what God tells Abram in this, soon to be Abraham. He says, "Go to the land I will show you." Not go to Canaan, not go 500 miles and then take a right. Your destination will be, right ahead. It's just go to the land I will show you. Future tense. Basically, God is saying, I will reveal the destination en route. Or basically, when you get there, I'll be like, oh, by the way, you have arrived at your destination. Put yourself in Abraham's, in his sandals for a moment. 75 years old is a stage where a lot of people are thinking more about retirement than setting out on new journeys and relocation. You're living in the land of the Ur of the Chaldeans. It's one of the most sophisticated cities in the ancient world. He had established business relationships. He had extended family connections. He had cultural familiarity, and his retirement plan was probably in place. Then God shows up and essentially said this to him: leave all of this and go somewhere. I'll tell you along the way. I'll tell you when you get there. And any reasonable person would probably have some questions like, where exactly are we going? How long is this journey going to take? What will I do for income along the way? And what's the timeline on this whole great nation thing? That sounds really good, but what does that actually look like and mean? But verse 4 says that Abram went as the Lord had told him. There's no record of an argument. There's no record of a negotiation going on for more details, no request for a business plan or for a feasibility study. Abraham heard God's call and followed, even though the destination was unknown. So why does God work this way? Why doesn't he just give us the complete roadmap along the way? Wouldn't that be great again if you're like, God, can you show me what the next 5 years are going to look like? Can you just kind of map things out for me so I can be as prepared as possible? I like to plan and be prepared. I want to be a good steward of the opportunities in front of me. Well, I think it's because the journey itself is part of what he's doing in us. If Abraham had known from the beginning that the promised land would involve battles with local kings, a famine that would drive them to Egypt, and decades of waiting for the promised son, would he have said yes? Maybe he would have. Maybe not. God reveals his plan to us one step at a time because often that's all we can handle. If you think about it, sometimes God's like, if I told you what the next 5 years were going to look like, you'd mess it up. But instead, if I show you one step and you take it, then I'll show you the next one and you'll end up where you need to be. So sometimes the not knowing is exactly what builds the kind of faith that he wants to develop in us. And think about it, Abraham's faith that he's known for wasn't built in one decision. It was built over 25 plus years of following God's step-by-step instructions. Each step of the journey prepared him for the next step. Each test strengthened his trust for greater tests to come. By the time that Abraham gets there and he's offering Isaac on Mount Moriah, Abraham had already learned through experience that the God who calls us to impossible places is the same God who provides in impossible circumstances. But it raises an important question. How do we know when God is calling us to follow him? When he's calling us to follow him somewhere? In our age of competing voices and constant noise, how do we discern God's whisper from all the other sounds? And the answer to that comes from one of my favorite stories about the prophet Elijah. He's had this great victory on Mount Carmel as he's faced off with the prophets of Baal. He has this deal where he taunts them back and forth. It's this kind of fun scene to read is his interactions while they're trying to get their God to answer. Maybe he's asleep. Maybe he's on vacation. Maybe he's taking a restroom break. Maybe maybe you just need to try harder or whatever like that and stuff. And then he has the altar doused with water. He prays to God. God sends down fire and all of this. It's an amazing scene. And then the next thing we find is Elijah running for his life because Jezebel goes, I'm going to kill you. Like, do you not remember what just happened? How God showed his power, but she says a word. He's freeing for his life. He's now exhausted, discouraged, and hiding in a cave when we find him in 1 Kings 19, starting in verse 11. It says, the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? God wasn't in the dramatic displays. Again, the wind, the earthquake, the fire, I think of like, a Hollywood scene where the pyrotechnics are just firing off left and right. Instead, he was in the gentle whisper. In the Hebrew there, one of the translations of it is the sound of sheer silence. And when you've ever experienced the sound of sheer silence, like it's loud, the nothingness, you're on edge. Your senses are alert because you're like something is going on here, even in the midst of complete silence there. And that's something that we learn here about following God. He often doesn't shout his directions and instructions. He often whispers them. And learning to follow where the path is unknown starts with learning to listen for his voice in quiet moments. So how do we cultivate that kind of listening? Well, first, we create space for silence. In our noisy, distracted world, we have to intentionally carve out quiet moments where we can hear God's whisper and, above life's competing voices. Second, pay attention to persistent themes. In our lives, there's some times where something just keeps coming up in our prayers and in our conversations with wise friends, and as we're reading scripture and circumstances that we experience. When that happens, it may be God speaking to us and saying, here is a path I want you to go. And third, we look for peace in places that don't make logical sense. A peace that doesn't make logical sense. Sometimes God's calling doesn't come as excitement or as certainty, but just an unexplainable peace about a direction that doesn't make sense on paper. Now, I like to give this caveat. Just because something seems out there doesn't automatically mean that it's the voice of God and the will of God. Sometimes we're like, that's the craziest thing imaginable. It must be what God's calling me to do. But if you go back to number 2 and you see God speaking through his word and you see the sense in prayer and your friend speaking wise counsel and all of those things, and then God gives you something that looks a little bit out of the box, you might go, okay, I think this may actually be God calling me to do that in the midst of it. So is God whispering something to your heart right now? For some, it might be a calling as immediate as this week, even today. Again, maybe you're heading into a new journey like we have coming up this week, stepping into a future that's both exciting and uncertain. You don't know what your major will end up, how your career path will unfold, or who the people are that will shape the next several years of your life. But here's what I do know. The same God who has been faithful for this season of your life is the same God who will be faithful in the years to come. And he's calling us to trust him in the new chapter, even though we can't see how the pages will unfold. But maybe you're in a different season of life, and God is calling you to step into the unknown. Perhaps he's been stirring in your heart about a ministry role that again, feels bigger than the experience level that you have at this point. And you keep thinking, I'm not qualified for this, but the opportunity keeps presenting itself, and others who know you keep suggesting you for that and talking to you about it. Maybe there's something to that. Maybe he's been calling us to have that difficult conversation with a family member, not because we've got the right words or have it all figured out, but because you sense there's healing that needs to happen and someone has to take the first step. Or maybe you're here today in this room or you're watching online and you've sensed God calling you to come into a relationship with him, to meet him for the very first time. But you've been waiting for more certainty about what this would mean for your life. And whether you're 18 or 80, the invitation is still the same. You don't have to know the whole journey before you take the first step. And a reason, again, that God doesn't show us the entire journey and path up front is because often he knows it's more than we can handle, but also because the journey, the process of learning to trust him day by day, step by step, is part of how he transforms us into the people he's created us to be. So, again, let's address a question that may come to mind, and we have mentioned this every week in the series because this is the reality of our lives so often. What happens when we step out in faith and the path gets harder than we expected? Like we said earlier, Abraham's journey to the promised land wasn't a smooth trip. It included famines, conflicts with local kings, family tensions with Lot, and decades of waiting for the son that God had promised. But through every challenge, God proved faithful to his word. Following God doesn't mean the path will be easy. It means that the guide is trustworthy and the destination is sure. I think about George Washington Carver. He left a comfortable position at what we now know as Iowa State University in 1896 to join the faculty at the struggling Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Friends thought he was making a terrible career move. He's leaving this well-established university up in the north to teach at a small, underfunded school primarily for African Americans in the post-Reconstruction South. But he felt that he was called to use his scientific gifts to help impoverished farmers, especially those who had been slaves or their descendants. And he couldn't have known that while he was there, what God would use him to do to revolutionize Southern agriculture, that his research with peanuts and with sweet potatoes would transform the economy and the region, and that he would become one of the most respected scientists of his day. Later, someone asked him about that sense of calling to leave Iowa State, and he said, "I believe that God had called me to be of the greatest good to the greatest number of my people." And he followed, even though the path itself seemed risky, and his obedience blessed not just the South, but the entire nation. Sometimes the difficulty along the path aren't signs that we've missed God's direction. And a lot of times that's what we think. God, I stepped out, you called me to do this, and I stepped, and boom, I hit a roadblock. I must not have heard you right. That's not always what it means. Sometimes there are opportunities for God to prove his faithfulness and to grow our faith. So what if we became a church full of people who would trust God's whisper even when we can't see the whole path ahead? What if we became a community of people who said, I don't know exactly how this is going to work out, but I trust the one who's calling me? What if families in our church made life decisions not based on perfect certainty, but on their sense of God's leading and their confidence in his faithfulness? What if individuals embraced the call to find their ones, to invest in them, in a relationship with them, to love them and value simply because they're created in the image of God, and also pray that God would call them and draw them to himself? And what if people who had been considering following Jesus would take that step, not because all the questions were answered, but because they sensed this gentle whisper saying, come and see? Let's be the kind of church and the kind of people that hear God's whisper together, that we create a culture where it's normal to say, I'm not exactly sure what God's calling me to, but I'm going to take the next step and trust him for the rest. When we follow God's call, even when the path is unknown, we don't just impact our lives. We've been talking about this throughout the series as well. Abraham's willingness to follow God's call didn't just change his life. It literally changed the course of human history. Every person who has ever been blessed by Abraham's faith. We read the heroes of the faith, and right there, Abraham, all throughout it. And every person who has accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior and Lord has been blessed and can trace their blessing back to the moment when Abraham heard God's whisper say, I will go. Your willingness to follow God today might have ripple effects that you'll never fully understand. The ministry you step into could touch lives in ways that you've never imagined. The relationship you pursue reconciliation with might become a testimony of God's healing power. And the decision you make to follow Jesus might inspire others in your family to do the same. I was thinking about this week. There are people in my life who taught a Sunday school class, who did various other things when I was a child, or when I was in student ministry, or when I was in college. And now the things that I get to do and the opportunities I have and anything God is doing to work through me, they've had a part in it, even though they may or may not be aware of that. And the reality is there's so many of us in this room where that same exact story could be told, that there are people in your life that had an impact on you, and the impact that you have on the world, they got to have a part in it. We never fully know the ripple effects that can come when we take a step of faith. So as we close this morning, I want us to listen carefully, not to my voice, but to the gentle whisper of God's Spirit in your heart. Is he calling you to something? Is there a step of faith that he's been inviting you to take? For those of you that are in transition, again, heading off to college, starting new jobs, entering new seasons of life, remember that every transition is an opportunity to trust God more deeply. You may not know what the next chapter holds, but you know the author of your story. Maybe he's calling you to step into a relationship with him for the first time, and you don't have to have all your questions answered. Abraham didn't know everything about the journey before he started walking. He just knew that the God who was calling him was trustworthy. Maybe he's calling us as followers of Christ to step into something new. Maybe it's a ministry, a relationship, a life change, an act of obedience, and we don't have to see the whole path before we take the first step. We just have to trust that the God who is calling us to the journey is the same God who will guide us through it. And here's what I know. The God who called Abraham out of Ur is the same God who wants to work in your life today. The same God who spoke to Elijah in a gentle whisper is the same God who is speaking to our hearts and our lives right now. And he may not give us a roadmap, but he will give us something better. He'll give us his presence along the way. He may not show us our destination, but he'll show us the next step. And he may not answer all our questions, but he'll prove his faithfulness as we walk with him. Faith follows even when the path is unknown. Not because the path is safe, but because the guide is trustworthy. Not because the journey is easy, but because the destination is sure. He is calling us. The question is, will we follow? Let's pray.